When Mohamed Bouazizi set himself on fire 10 years ago, he couldn't have known that his suicide in Tunisia would ignite the entire region. 10 years later, Tunisia enjoys relative security under an elected government with a mostly free press. But every other country scorched by the Arab Spring's fires has suffered instability, horrific war, or hasn't really changed at all.
So the grievances that we've been talking about, the grievances that were there in 2010 are still there in 2020. And so people who went out demonstrating in 2010 are still angry.
26-year-old Bouazizi reportedly killed himself because he was frustrated with his poor job prospects, repeated corruption, and humiliation at the hands of police. Turns out he wasn't alone. After he died from his wounds the following month, his funeral became a protest. A week later, protesters ousted Tunisian autocrat Zine El Abidine Ben Ali, who fled to Saudi Arabia after 23 years in power. His sudden fall inspired activists in Egypt who went out on the streets on January 25th to demand that President Hosni Mubarak step down. 2 weeks later, Mubarak, another symbol of the old autocrats who've calcified the Arab world for more than a generation, stepped down too. That momentous event spread protests across the Middle East, united by a single demand. The people want the downfall of the regime. But if the demand was the same, the results varied. Dictators in Libya and Yemen were deposed and killed amidst bloody civil wars that are still going on today. Bashar al-Assad clung to power in Syria through 10 years of horrific civil war that's left his country in ruins and is also still going on. Egypt tasted democracy, but popular protests eventually toppled the country's first ever freely elected president. Now a military-backed autocrat is back in charge. Meanwhile, wealthy Gulf Arab monarchies like Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and Kuwait gave financial handouts to their subjects, appeasing protesters and staying in power. Out of all of them, only Tunisia can now be called a democracy.
Tunisia today is a country where you can express yourself freely. You can write anything, pretty much anything you want on Facebook or in the media. You can say whatever you want on TV. You're free. There are elections.
But Tunisia was the exception, and the terrible suffering throughout the region defied borders. Tens of millions were displaced throughout the Middle East and sought refuge in Europe, some risking everything to cross the Mediterranean, a passage that claimed thousands of lives. Powerful terrorist groups like ISIS flourished amid the chaos of Syria, then spilled into Iraq.
And what we found out is that tanks and firepower and the willingness to use brute force can really extinguish that human spirit, that willingness to oppose and to fight for one's rights.
But if Arabs weren't rewarded for their revolutions, other nations on the fringes of the Arab world benefited at their expense. Iran exploited the conflict to empower its Shia Muslim proxy groups throughout the region, like Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Houthis in Yemen, while Turkey used the moment to crush Kurdish separatists while backing Islamist groups throughout the Middle East. And remember those moneyed monarchies who paid off their populations to keep them from protesting? Well, they've benefited the most. With traditional Arab power brokers like Egypt, Libya, and Syria laid low, Arab Gulf kingdoms like Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates are more powerful than ever. And more threatened. They've been alarmed by both the rise of political Islam, which threatens their power, and by the rise of Iran, which now controls fighting forces in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. So the Gulf Arab monarchies have found an unlikely friend in their old enemy, Israel.
In the last decade, you saw a further strengthening of ties between the Gulf states and Israel surrounding this issue of Iran. It deepened to some extent as Iran's involvement in the region became also more prominent.
Thanks to negotiations led by the Trump administration, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Morocco all just signed deals recognizing Israel for the first time. That's led to a big shift in the balance of power. Instead of Arab countries and Iran up against Israel, it's now Arab countries and Israel versus Iran. And that's why many of the Arab Spring's big winners saw President Trump as a friend and made may see President-elect Joe Biden as a potential enemy. But Biden will still face lots of challenges in the region.
The administration is likely going to have to reassure its America's traditional allies in the region, whom I think were very reticent and not, let's put it this way, they were not assured by the approach of the Obama administration. So he's going to have to deal with a perception that Biden is essentially a third Obama term.
10 years later, the Arab Spring isn't really over, even if it has quieted down. The problems that caused the uprisings, poverty, youth unemployment, political oppression, and brutal policing, either haven't improved or have gotten much worse. People across the region are exhausted and desperate after a decade of disaster.
One of the lessons of the Arab Spring, unfortunately, is that repression works, that the wall of fear can be rebuilt.
And those problems could set the Middle East on fire again, just like Mohammed Bouazizi did 10 years ago. All they need is the right spark. Matt Bradley, NBC News.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.